first of all kind of introduce the session and then get everyone to introduce themselves. So first of all, I'm Stuart Rex. I'm the Commercial Director for Webtrends Optimize. I'm sort of hosting today. I've badged myself up as a low budget version of Stephen Mulhern, and I was told I should try and aim higher. But that's sort of my main purpose for today. Far from an expert in these things, but here to try and tease information out of the experts that we've got joining us. So the summary for the webinar is that it's been nearly 4 years since GA4 launched, and we know that many of our customers and people that we speak to are still a little bit foggy on why numbers don't match expectations. And what we're looking to do today is get the panel to unlock the challenges and common pitfalls of GA4, learning why there's widespread confusion around data models, attribution, understanding the critical role of hypothesis-driven testing, how to interpret results accurately, even when faced with discrepancies across platforms, and to crucially explore the latest in consent management, including consent mode v2, and the implications for your data and analytics strategies, and how you can leverage these in your testing program. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jill Quick. Jill, if you could introduce yourself and do a bit of a who you are, where'd you come from? Actually, I should be still a black, not Stephen Mulhern. Who you are and where'd you come from?
Hopefully you can hear me. You can hear
me,
marvelous. It's just always guess, you know, and you're like, oh, I feel like I've been downgraded. So my name is Jill, and I am an analytics consultant and trainer. So my day-to-day work revolves around working with brands and companies to make sure they get the most out of their measurement strategy, and that could be from reviews or audits or training. And I secretly love well, I don't think it's a secret. I love my job. I love what I do. So anything to do with analytics, I can talk your ear off, basically.
Cool. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself? And I mean, I sort of introduced you as the opposite of Christian Horner when it comes to consent. But if you could do a better job than that, that'd be great.
Certainly, and you know, what a glowing review already. I love that. Well, yes, I am Michael. I work at Rocket Mill, an agency here in the south of the UK. I actually work remotely. I'm based down in Bournemouth, so lots of nice forest and lots of beach to do. Take the dog down to. I've been in the industry coming up 10 years, and I specialise in implementation, integration, and consent platforms, which should hopefully put me in good stead for today's talk.
Absolutely. And Mr. Harbour, yourself?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stu. Yeah, so no glowing review for me, but I'll take it. So I'm James. I'm currently leading customer success at Webtrends Optimize. I entered this industry similar to Michael, maybe around 10 to 12 years ago. I started off with analytics implementation for an insurance company based in Norfolk, Aviva. From there, went to SessionCam and then Glassbox in kind of product teams, and have worked closely with people kind of, you know, with their kind of digital aspect of tools, you know, pulling them all together, making sure they're getting what they need. And now, say, working for Webtrends Optimized, you can currently see the small logo behind me in the background. I say leading customer success and making sure people are getting what they need from our platform. So hopefully I can bring some light to other tools you're using in and around analytics today throughout the conversation.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for the brief introductions. I thought we'd sort of kick this off by a common topic whenever the name Google is mentioned, and that's that it's, you know, it's always changing. And thought we'd just kind of bring to the panel and say what key things have changed since GA4 launched, and ultimately why is this causing us problems in measurement. I think everyone's going to have an opinion on this, but Jill, if you've got some thoughts around sort of particularly the parts around key events and conversions, that might be a really good place to start.
Yeah. So hopefully my sound's going to maintain, fingers crossed. If not, feel free to cut me off and move it on to somebody else. GA4, whenever I do any work with a client, I always put in bright yellow highlighted text at the top that GA4 is constantly changing and evolving, and there's some pros to that. There's some things in GA4 that I really love when they make a change. There are some things that I don't love as much, and I think it's made it really challenging for people that are not necessarily in the world of analytics 24/7 to keep up with those changes. Now, a gentle reminder that the shock of the change, I think, is down to the fact that Universal Analytics maintained a consistent void of no updates for about a decade, right? So we've all been using Universal. We thought it was really easy. We've forgotten, and some of us are old enough to remember, the changes between Urchin and Classic and UA. The user interface changed, the reports changed, the features changed, and then nothing for ages. Now, one of the recent changes that we were talking about this week, and I'll mention it because not everybody is aware of it. Google have changed some terminology, and as of Thursday last week, they kind of dabbled with this concept last year. Everybody shouted it down, and they've kind of come out gung ho, going, "We're gonna maintain it." And that's the change of labeling what a key objective is for a business. So in Universal Analytics, it was a goal. Then in GA4, it was a conversion. And now they're saying that they're going to change conversions to key events, right? Key events. Now, what that means is when you log into GA4, you won't see session conversion rate. You'll now see session key event rate. However, just to make things a little bit fun, they've not gotten rid of conversions. Conversions are now only related to the previous conversions that were loaded to Google Ads. Now, for me, like, I hate this. I'm like, why have you changed terminology that is consistent with an industry? We're talking to people that are from conversion rate optimization. You don't say key event rate optimizer. It's just too much. Now, the reason why they've done it, I think, is because there's always been an inconsistency with the data between GA4 and Google Ads. And instead of trying to look at things which we'll talk about today around the change in look-back windows, the change in attribution, the change in your settings, how you migrate to GA4, they've gone, hey, here's a solution. Let's just change the name to key events, and we'll leave the AdWords stuff to a separate report in the attribution area. Personally, I think it doesn't actually solve the problem. They've just moved it somewhere else, and I think it's going to cause more layers of confusion as we move forward. We will share a link with the show notes for a website page where Google do list all of the changes that they're making, because their documentation isn't always great when they do this. And who knows what the next thing will be, but it looks like this is going to stay. So fun times, let's learn some new language and redo all of our reports potentially.
So with that positive one, we obviously had the exciting news, Mike, fair while ago now, that consent mode v2 was coming in. Everyone on this call is, of course, going to have implemented everything well before the deadline, because you're all interested in these things. But it'd be really good to know from your perspective how consent mode has affected this, and particularly around sort of attribution, and what that's meant for GA4 data.
Yeah, absolutely. As if GA4 isn't complicated enough, you've now got this thing that's come in, which is well intentioned. It wants to make sure that everyone using GA4 is doing so in compliance to the many laws around the world, in particular Digital Markets Act, which was earlier this year. What we're finding, though, the trouble is that you've got varying situations across different businesses and clients. So you could even have people that have completely ignored the fact that you need a compliant cookie banner on your website, and now suddenly you've had to catch up, many years, all between, the beginning of this year and March, which means either implementations have been rushed or implementations have been done well, but all of the educating of the stakeholders hasn't gone ahead. So you might notice that as soon as that consent management platform's gone in, the traffic has suddenly tanked and everyone's panicking, or actually that is quite a normal thing to see, and things that we are used to seeing now after many years of all of these consent challenges. But in terms of being able to load up someone's GA4, look at the data and go, this is right or this is wrong, that has got so much more complicated. And I feel sorry. I mean, it's a headache for me, and I'm in the interface, 8 hours a day. For anyone who's wearing many hats in their business, it must be an absolute nightmare right now.
Yep. So James, that kind of tees you up nicely into how this has been affecting us and some of our customers from a testing perspective, and some of the discrepancies that we're seeing as well. So it'd be good to kind of get your views on how do we keep up from a testing perspective when we're hearing from two experts who are in this all day, every day, 5 days a week. This is a key part of what we need to do within an experimentation platform, but it's one of many key parts, and it's one that we know is a constant source of frustration for our customer base.
Yeah, I think if I go right back to how I kind of envisage organizations using all the platforms they have, typically we'll see GA being at the center of those. It's always kind of the source of truth that's used. It's always kind of sits at the center of everything else that goes on. The vast majority of people will have GA, but the vast majority of people won't have all the tools which sit around them. So as long as you're maintaining what you're doing within GA and what you're doing around consent and anything else you're doing, as long as you're managing that and you're appropriately then kind of liaising with anyone else in the business who's responsible for other tools, this should be fine in terms of an overhead. It is an overhead, but it's an overhead that you have to manage. And I think if you keep on top of it, you'll be absolutely fine. And as Michael's mentioned there, people have waited a long time and put this off for a long period of time and have become kind of out of date. But also, what are they doing in their other platforms? If they're not doing it with analytics, how are they handling it elsewhere? And we have a lot of things that we kind of employ, different mechanisms, different ways which we can kind of embed within consent, for example, to kind of marry up with other tools, particularly GA, for example. But I just think that you can get yourself in a lot of debt quite quickly, if you don't keep up with this stuff. And as long as everyone is on the same page, we'll dig into it, I guess, a little bit later in the conversation. But if everyone's on the same page and everyone's following the same pattern with those updates, you're absolutely fine. The minute you fall behind on one is the minute that everyone else in the business is unclear on what you're doing, what you're tracking, and that's where the confusion starts. And actually, investigations that we do, for being quite transparent, investigations that we do, typically end up in being or coming out that something was out of date, someone wasn't aware of something, and actually the investigations that we do tend to be negligible because they're not required, because something else is actually happening. And again, we'll get into it in more detail. But my thing here is, whatever your single source of truth is, which in this case we're talking around GA4, as long as everything else is marrying up and you're keeping up to date with everything, you won't have any problems. I said the minute you fall behind is the minute you'll come across them.
Absolutely. I think that's interesting you mentioned that, and I think Jill will be really good to get your perspective on this. I think James has really started off the topic of why there is so much confusion and misunderstanding around the GA4 data model, but we know that this gets even more complicated when it comes to allocation and attribution. It'd be really good for you to kind of expand on that and what you've seen in the last 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, or probably even longer. I've been doing this probably about November 2020. October, we all ignored it, right? Like when they announced GA4, we're like, not now, there's a pandemic, leave me alone. And then we all kind of got started on it. Okay, so I've got quite a lot that's in my head to get out then. So
you got 5 minutes.
I would probably say, out of all the migrations that I've done, and we're now long past the UA sunset date, so I'm now reviewing GA4 accounts. So we've gone back to kind of the doom of UA disappearing. And I definitely see a number of issues and themes that are very similar. And I think a lot of that is down to people wanting GA4 to match UA and not quite realizing that it is a completely different data model, and that there are some things in UA that just won't work the way that you would want it to in GA4 because it's a user and event driven model. Now, I recently did a review for a client and they didn't have any documentation. This is common. Mike probably will nod to go, yes, we work with clients where you go, have you got any documentation? And they go, no, maybe a spreadsheet if you're lucky. So I'm reviewing their account and they had so many events and it was all nested in these custom events that they'd created. But because nobody had communicated it, like the debt that James was talking about, I think the debt also comes in the way that you communicate how you're using your analytics and tech stacks as well. And what they had is, so lucky for them, they were a company that sold courses to teachers in the United States, and they had a custom event that was able to track and understand using something called user properties. They were able to understand the type of customer. So was it a teacher? Was it a head teacher? What state were they in? Now, what that custom event meant is that they could build audiences to understand how different cohorts behave. They could apply that to their CRO testing. They could apply it to their personalization. But then equally, I've worked with people where they didn't even turn on the enhanced events apart from the page view events. So they weren't calculating if people were downloading content or video plays or outbound link clicks. And I regularly have conversations with people that don't understand the way that GA4 was processed. And I would argue that people didn't understand how UA was processed. Like, I was very busy as a consultant with UA, just for that wasn't perfect either. And I think the reason with what you were saying there, Stuart, about attribution, the reason that things don't match when you look at something as common as acquisition, how people found you, that can be down to the fact that there are 3 default channel groupings. And a lot of people assume there is 1 default channel grouping. We've now got, if you look at your report, the user report is just showing people that fired the first visit event, which links back to what Mike's going to talk about with consent management platforms. They've not identified this person before. They've accepted your cookies. They are technically a new user, right? Now, that report is working on first touch user scoped, meaning will only show the first touch point of that first visit, and any conversion, any key events, they are now a look back window of 30 days. But when you look at the acquisition report underneath it, the traffic acquisition, that is the session default channel grouping, and that's using the first touch session scope, meaning it will only show the first touch point of an individual session. And the look back window for that is 90 days. If you look at the conversion report, that is event scoped, which is linked to your attribution settings in your admin, which is typically data driven unless you've changed it. And the look back window for that is 90 days as well. Now, the difference just between those 3, you've got people looking at the user report thinking it's showing all users, and it's not. It's just new users, first touch point, 30-day look back window. The challenge we have with the traffic acquisition reports is it doesn't show multi-touch point, right? If it just shows you the first session source, if that was organic and then the second one was PPC, that's not showing. So Google really should be giving us a report to show a multi-touch point step, not renaming conversions to key events and moving conversions for Google Ads into attribution. It's like, no, people want to know why the numbers don't match. It's because of the way that the program's built, right? This is for me what I would like them to fix. If you're listening, Google, we'll play really nicely with it, but please give us the multi-step approach. And I've seen people build reports where they pick the default channel grouping, which only shows people that have converted. So if you've got a 2% conversion rate, well, you're only showing 2% of your users out of 100% of the people theoretically. So there's already there quite a lot to unpack as to why people don't see the numbers match what they should be seeing before we even get to problems with, the consent side of things. And
well, that's Jill, what I was about to
job of explaining it.
That's what I was about to move on to, is to say, so then we layer in consent, and Mike was going to say, could you expand on how that then causes us some further challenges?
Sure thing. Well, let's say in an ideal world, you've got an absolutely immaculate GA4 setup, and despite all the complications, you're getting the best data that you can. When you then throw in a consent management platform, and all consent management platforms sadly aren't built equally, there are some lacking a few key features, some with a few quirks that you need to navigate. You can see, massive disruption to then, completely scupper your immaculate setup. So some common things we see maybe are, well, really common one is if you've got a banner with no site overlay, really small banner that's really easy to ignore, you can say go to a shop, fill your basket full of products, and it's only when it's in the in the way of your checkout now button. Do you accept? And then, you know, you're 20 minutes into your session, all the information you typically get when you first landed, like, you know, traffic source, refer, a landing page, already gone. So that can cause some significant gaps in your reporting. You've then got, you know, issues if the CMP's been set up incorrectly, particularly the consent management platforms that use auto blocking, which is always a little bit too enthusiastic for what you need. What can sometimes happen is they'll land on the site, the Google Analytics cookies will set, the CMP will then delete them, and then when you accept cookies, it will set them again. So in GA4's eyes, there's been 2 users on that site in that moment. So what you'd see, where you typically expect a drop in traffic after installing a consent management platform, actually your traffic doubles, but your engagement rate is horrible. And that's usually a symptom of something like that happening. And again, lots and lots of things that can go wrong there. So not only in platform are there challenges, but outside on the front end of your website, there are, you know, many pitfalls awaiting you.
Perfect. I mean, as I think we're seeing, this is all starting to layer up, and we're not even really into the particularly juicy bit. So yeah, we've had consent mode V2 for coming on a month now. 21 days, Mike, is that right? Something like
Well,
that.
I'm glad you've been counting, because I've just been shelving that in my brain for my own sanity. But yes, something like that.
Something like that. So for those that aren't fully aware, could you just give us a sort of bit of an overview as to what consent mode V2 is, why it's important for businesses to properly understand it, rather than, yeah, that's a future me problem. It's no longer a future you problem.
Indeed, it is a problem of today. So
Yes.
yeah, so give you a very brief history. Consent mode V1 came out a few years ago, and the main selling point of that was to provide cookieless information to your Google platform. So the user comes to your website for the first time, actually doesn't want to be served cookies in the normal way and opts out via your cookie banner. You could still send basic information that didn't use cookies or any local identifiers stored in a user's browser to give basic, very basic information compared to the traditional tracking, which largely helps all your really clever machine learning type products that Google have as part of their services. So in GA4, it would look at all the cookieless data, compare it to your cookie track data, and then be able to fill in some of the blanks. I think Google's latest figure was it would reclaim 65% of the lost traffic due to opting out of cookies, say. So then we got consent mode V2, which I believe was announced December last year, but of course we were all very intent on getting, you know, all the work done before the Christmas break. So it seems that most people tackled it in January. And the focus there is mainly around regulations and the law in the European Economic Area. Because Google are a big processor of data, they've been declared what's called a, oh, I've got keys on the brain, key holder, key master, key something, a big nominated thing. The name has just escaped me, but they've been nominated, so they're being held to stricter standards, which means that the declaration of the level of consent that a user has chosen via the cookie banner must be attached to every hit that is sent to Google servers in order to declare that the website is tracking users compliantly. So Google now have said, you know, you've got 2 options. You've got the basic and the advanced. Basic is just to comply with the law and track people who have opted in and don't track people that haven't opted in, which some people see as a good ethical choice. But if you want to continue or start using the cookieless modeling, then you can do the consent mode V2 advanced. And then after you run that, I think it's for around 72 days, Google Ads, GA4 will then start to work out those missing gaps in your traffic using that cookieless data.
Makes enough sense to me. And James, I think it'd be really good to get your thought there on how this has been affecting testing as well, because some of this, you know, what we're seeing when people are hitting landing pages and then delays or non-acceptance, and what that's meaning for data that then comes through in the conversion package or versus data that comes through in GA4 and other reporting suites.
Yeah, I think it's almost a little bit self-explanatory self-explanatory off the back of Mike's, kind of explanation, how many different options there are, how many different ways you can do things, how people are doing things currently, and all the different things which GA is doing in the background to fill in the data. If you consider ourselves or any other platform that you're using as something which is employing an entirely different mechanism to try to achieve the same thing, you're already into a situation where things will be different, for example. And for the majority of other tools out there aren't mechanisms to fill in those blanks either. So not only are you looking at a different mechanism in terms of how you're handling consent, from a user perspective and from the front end, you're also talking about how the data in the background is also collected, attributed, pulled together, aggregated, whatever you want to kind of call it. You're looking at so many differentials between the two platforms in our case, and this is without encountering all the other platforms which you're using, CRMs, whatever it is you're looking at, you're not even looking at those. So I think my thing is, again, we're doing things differently. How are we doing them differently? All depends on how we want to implement the thing or what we want to try and achieve with each of the things we're using. And just understanding that in the background, we're doing one thing with our data, we're showing you a data set, GA4 might be doing something totally different. And you just have to, again, comes back to that situation around understanding what you're doing and understanding what you're tracking, which we'll come on to. It's all going to have an impact. As long as you can measure the impact and understand it, you can be in a place where you can manage it efficiently, I think.
Cool. So yeah, I think really you've answered my next question, so I'm going to just jump over to Jill, if that's all right. And Jill, so have you seen much of a change in your clients' trust in GA4 and the impact that's had on marketing teams?
So interestingly, I started any process with clients doing scope surveys, and one of my questions is what data don't you trust and why don't you trust it? And I think sometimes the lack of trust comes down to a lack of knowledge and confidence in GA4. Now, I've spent over a decade doing audits and training, and as I said before, UA was never perfect either. Most brands had issues with their UA setup. I've had many, we have like, me and Mike have these what do we call them, like brain trust tracks, where we're like having a bit of a rant about things that are going on and things that we find. So it was never perfect. And then the interface, however, of UA, I think was a little bit easier to interpret, so people felt a bit more confident in UA, so they trusted the numbers. And I've used a term called confabulations of data, which is the lies you tell honestly, that you have a dashboard and you go, ta-da, and you're assuming that all of that data is correct and it's solid and it's wonderful and you're going to base those decisions on them. And because UA didn't change for a long time and people found it a bit more intuitive, they trusted it. Now, GA4 requires a learning journey, and I think some of it is a bit nonsensical. It's not straightforward. You have to learn it. It's not like previous versions. And I think that lack of trust in GA4 comes from the knowledge and confidence. But then when you layer the challenge we've got with CMPs now that we didn't really have with UA. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that you could put anything on a website. Nobody cared. They were like, yeah, track away, do whatever you want. You can have a banner. You don't have a banner. It's fine. And now we've got issues where, the CMP can cause your traffic to come in as direct or unassigned because it's not fired properly. You've got people that maybe missed some steps in their GA4 migration. So when they look at the reports and send them to people and they haven't communicated how GA4 is different, how sessions are calculated, the change in default channel groupings, attribution windows, look back windows, the fact that you're probably tracking different actions because of the events that we have now and the dimensions and metrics that are slightly better, but you need to communicate it. And I think that's what we need, to have a clearer communication and plain English documentation so people can understand what's happening. And then I think the trust will be a little bit easier to come through.
Completely. Couldn't agree with you more. Nothing further to add. So I think let's with where we are in the session, and really the thing that I guess most people are probably here for is to try and pick the collective brains of the geniuses on this call, not myself, into what we can do for practical advice and strategies to try and fix some of these challenges, overcome this, and get confidence in that data. So with that said, Mike, what are some of the practical steps businesses can take to gain confidence in data and their analytics practices?
Oh, got you. And what a big question that is. I suppose there are certainly two routes to it. You can either, get very hands-on yourself, get very familiar, excuse me, get very much educated in all of these new factors. As Jill said, 10 years ago, you just stuck a script on the website on all pages and off you went. No, far more complicated. So you might have to get your hands dirty. I'm a bit biased in saying actually when you get into it, it's quite interesting, but I realise it's not to everyone's taste. I guess the second option is to make sure that you partner with someone that can not only help you with the technical side, but can help translate that for you. So one of the things we've had from clients is, effectively being a translation service, they've got to report to their internal stakeholders. When you speak to someone on the C-suite that might only have 5 minutes for their next meeting, trying to explain reporting scopes and, all of these technical code-based things, they're just going to glaze over and, not give you the time of day. Whereas if you can partner with someone who can say, this is what this means in layman's terms, feel free to circulate that. I'm sure that'll make your life a lot easier. So aside from the actual problem solving itself, of which there are many things to check, it's I guess it's like, there are bad plumbers, there are bad milkmen potentially. It's always going to be hard to choose the right partner for you with the right level of technical expertise and to work for your budget. But absolutely, those are your two first steps onto getting this all sorted.
No, cool. I mean, that sage advice. I think what I was really hoping for is more sort of detail on, things you should do. So things like questioning the setup, things like, is that the best it could be? How would you go about tailoring some of the reports to make sure that you're getting the data that matters most to you? Some kind of like, obviously you need the expertise, but what kind of practical things can people do to try and help them along this path, beyond saying this is a problem for an adult?
Got you. So in fact, that is an interesting point, because something we typically have seen again and did originally see when consent management platforms became compulsory, is people were so focused on the drop in volume that was being recorded, where they were losing traffic to people opting out. They never stopped to question, why are we tracking these things and what actually is valuable to track? Bounce rate's great, but unless you're running, content marketing, or, you're a blog site or you're a news website, does that actually matter when it comes to generating bottom line value? So there's always going to be a discrepancy, that even in the UA days, your data was never going to be 100% correct. And I think that gap has grown bigger. But what you've got to think about is not just all the data, why can't we track all the data, but rather what can't we track at the moment, which would be ideal to track for our business to understand how we can generate growth, how we can understand our users' needs. And of course, that's the beauty of GA4, is that it's event-based and it's highly customizable. So it's basically, a sandbox for you to create things that really mean something to your data. And that is, either by employing a developer or using Google Tag Manager, say. And that's what I'd say about that.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that. I think, it's, for me, it's also about understanding opt-in rate, effect that has on your data, and but your point is there's never been 100% correct data is absolutely valid. And I think one of the things, James, that you and I talk about with many of our customers is understanding your source of truth. If GA4 is your source of truth, then trying to get everything else to match as close as you can to that. If you say that your testing tool is going to be the source of truth for this data, then that's the thing that you then try and work off of. But it's really about communicating what that source of truth is, why it's the source of truth, and then tracking things through. So yeah, thank you very much for that. So James, this one I think is probably for you. So how should businesses approach A/B testing with GA4, and why is having a hypothesis so crucial?
Yeah, another good question. So actually, this could be a bit broader, I think, because when you're using, for testing in particular, we always build a hypothesis. You're trying to prove or disprove something by testing something, which you have found somewhere, and you want to try and, work out whether that thing will have a positive or a negative impact. You must have a hypothesis to begin that process. Actually, you must have a hypothesis really when you're trying to investigate anything, because, and this might be my own thoughts, but I'm maybe a little bit biased, but if you're digging into data to try and find something, if you haven't got a kind of a goal to achieve or something you're trying to find, what are you looking for? What are you actually trying to do in there? And it's really easy to get lost in these tools. With SessionCam, Glassbox, we had an incredible amount of data around, how people were engaging with pages, what they were doing on the pages, how far they were scrolling, if they were struggling, if they saw errors. But it was very easy just to go into there and to jump between the different reports and view things, and you get very lost very quickly. If you come in believing you're trying to find something you think is happening on the site, you think people are encountering a problem on this field, on this form, because of the formatting of the field, you can, definitively go to the point of the product which will give you the answer. It's incredibly inefficient to go in and just look at all the information as one, or to jump around looking at things. Yes, you will have daily, weekly, monthly reporting which you run. Yes, there'll be things you have to pull on a regular basis, which you will go to the same part of the product for. But if you haven't got a thought around what's going on, you haven't got a direction to go into, when you're using these products. So I believe having a hypothesis at the center of what you're doing, whether it's testing, whether you're investigating something, whether you're delving into something which you want to understand, that's your key starting point. And without doing so, without having that key starting point, I think you can waste, a lot of time. And if I kind of go sort of full circle and cover something which both Jill and Mike have mentioned in this, and I think it's really critical, converting stuff into layman's terms is really important. So having an understanding around the business, around what these things are, what they're saying, is as important as anything else. We used to have examples all the time. In SessionCam, we had reports like heat maps and kind of click maps, gave percentages and volume of clicks on certain parts of a page. We used to get so much feedback that it was different to GA's or UA at the time, link tracking. And actually, you delve into it in the nitty-gritty detail was in Universal Analytics, they were tracking a click, but they were also tracking where someone was going from that click, and that person had to achieve both of those things to be counted. In SessionCam, we were just counting the click on the element. We didn't care whether they reached the destination or not. And I think having that understanding at the center of what it is not only helps everyone across the business understand what it is you're reporting on or what you're telling them, but as I say, having that hypothesis in the middle will drive you to the right place quicker. And if you can convert what you're seeing into something that everyone can understand, Michael mentioned it perfectly, you get 30 seconds to explain to someone who's going to give you a decision as to whether you can do something or not. You can't sit there and talk about, well, there's certain clicks on this element achieve this, and in this, it's never going to wash. You have to go with something definitive and quick. So a hypothesis will give you a direction to go in, and it'll make it an incredibly efficient experience in using the product. Having everything in a way that anyone can understand, will make it much easier to get buy-in to make those changes. So maybe a really long answer to a simple question, but I think it's important.
Totally, and I think, Jill, that you and I have obviously had many a conversation over the years, and it would be with a lot of the businesses you work with, range in size from SMB through to hyper mega global enterprise, and it'd be really good to get your sort of perspective on some of the common themes and questions that businesses should be asking when analysing their data. Your kind of best practice in this area.
Something that I do, as I said before, is this concept of my scope surveys or discovery survey questions. It does take a bit of time, right? So it will take me anywhere between 6 and maybe 20 hours, depending on how many people filled out the survey and how big the company is, for me to understand what the themes and the common issues are. Now, the types of questions that I use will vary depending on the business and the project scope. However, I first of all ask that the scope survey is sent to anybody that is impacted by data collection. So that sees it not just going to the people that hired me, which is normally a marketing department. I might send this to sales, send this to any agencies you work with, any tech stack partners like your CRO agencies. Like, I want to know from everybody what they think. Now, there's a lot of questions that I have, but the kind of more favorite ones that I have, one is the what data don't you trust and why don't you trust it, because that helps me understand, is it the CMP, is it a knowledge gap problem, or is there a problem with how something's firing in GTM? It kind of helps me troubleshoot some of the problems a little bit easier. I then ask people what is important to them. Start with what's important for their performance reviews. People are selfish in a good way. They care about their work and what they're doing and how that's going to impact their bottom line, basically. Do I keep my job? Is everything going to be working? Just realised somebody started drilling outside the house, if you can hear that echo. Then there's also questions around the wider data points for the department and the business as a whole, which goes to what James was saying. Like, don't just look at data for the sake of it. What are the business objectives and measurement objectives we need to focus on for your website? My last question that I have for people is around what data or questions do you get about your work that you would love to have a report to go, ta-da, this is what's going on. Now, what I love about GA4 is that we can have a lot of reporting techniques that we never had in GA3. So one could be, we can build funnels and show elapsed time. We can do path analysis. We can layer sequential segments with what's going on, which is all freaking amazing that you can use to build hypotheses for things like CRO testing. But unless you understand what's important for the company and how you're going to use that data, you just have a sea of data for the sake of it. So if anybody wanted to explore it in a bit more detail, I'm going to do a write-up on scope questions, because I think you need to understand what is important to people and where are the gaps, because it could be that the way that your data collection or GA4 migration was implemented, that you've got loads of blind spots, that we can't answer the questions that are important to people within the business because you assumed that Google was going to track it, and then they realise, oh, we need an event for that, or that event's working but we haven't published the parameters, so we don't see the data in the interface. So as much as scope surveys can be quite time consuming, for me they are absolutely vital to really understand what are the pain points of the business and how can your data collection enhance all of the stuff that you're doing in terms of building a report, because that's ultimately all GA is for, right? It's a performance and measurement toolkit. Not to say marketing did stuff happened. It's hopefully to give the report to a person that can then say, here's your budget, here's your PO or whatever. So yeah, like that's one of the big things. And the drilling started outside, so I'm going to go on mute now for my bit.
Okay, no, that's cool. So I mean, we had a bit of time actually for a question that's come up in the Q&A. There will be 5 minutes for a Q&A afterwards, and if we don't have time to answer everything in the session, then we'll do some recording afterwards and send it out. But to address the question, how can businesses effectively manage tracking issues and consent platforms in the context of GA4? Mike, I don't think there's going to be anyone better to answer this than you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, again, it's a big question, but I guess you've got the technical side and you've got the stakeholder education side. So the technical side certainly helps if you're using Google Tag Manager, particularly if you have access and you can pop in and have a look and make sure that things are in alignment, shall we say. A good example that we see often, say you've got a lead form on your website and you're using GA4 to analyze it. You've got Google Ads for your marketing, and let's say using Webtrends Optimize for your A/B testing. One of those platforms could track when they click the submit button. One of those could track on the thank you page of the form. And one of those could track when you get validation from the server that form has been submitted. You're going to get different counts of each of those because, on clicking submit, they might not have filled in the captcha, or they might not have filled in all the required fields. For the thank you page, they might go forward and then back a step and view that twice. So there's always going to be known discrepancies between platforms, but there could be some unknown and unintended discrepancies. And if you're using Google Tag Manager, luckily it's a lovely visual interface where you can make sure that everything's firing on the same triggers or different triggers. So that would be step one to the technical, is to make sure everything's singing off the same hymn sheet, or if not, why not? Luckily, there's a good version history in there. So if you've got many parties involved, you can go straight to those that have posted those changes and ask them, what the situation is. Could be for a good reason, or it could be that they've missed something. So you've kind of got to get your detective hat on, have a little look around your existing setup and make sure everything is aligned the best it can be. Because again, there's always going to be a known discrepancy. What you want to reduce is the unintended discrepancy. And then when it comes to reporting internally to your stakeholders, again, it's that translation service you got to get going. You've got to ultimately what you're looking to do is build trust. And in order to build that trust, you need to be on top of what should not be the same versus what is unintentionally the same. So sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I've got deep into Google Tag Manager land. So
no,
did I hit the nail on the head?
That all makes good sense. And I think, for platforms like Webtrends Optimize or any of the other testing platforms for that matter, having any of those in Google Tag Manager will cause a flicker. So there are certain cases where, you definitely shouldn't be putting testing tools in Tag Manager. So there will be examples of things that should always sit in the head of a page. And it's then to contribute on top of what Michael said, making sure that anything that sits outside of Tag Manager is also well managed and that you've got data firing in the right order. We could probably go into a whole load of stuff around data layers, and that would be another probably 15 minutes of conversation that we should probably spare you in this context, but hopefully that kind of answers the original question anyway. So James, just to kind of further on that, what strategies do you recommend for businesses to ensure data integrity and trustworthiness in their reports? I know it's something that we are challenged on a, I was going to say daily, but it's probably hourly basis.
Yeah, I think actually Mike's probably stolen most of my comments here actually. However, he must have read my answers. I think that it was a really good example you gave. Another really good example of how you're tracking something and then how you're interpreting something. You're tracking a click on a button, you're tracking the form submission itself, you're tracking it on form completion. It's a really good example. My thing, and we started with this from the very beginning of this chat, really was all around the overhead of managing what you have and ensuring that it's kept up to date. And someone has to be accountable for that in an organization. The larger the organization, ironically, who have teams dedicated to it, I find are actually have more problems with this. In my experience, it tends to be, people in sort of teams that sit further away from those analytics teams, don't tend to interpret it the same way or understand what it's telling them. And typically they're using other tools, which they then try to align very quickly when they're not used to being or consuming the information they're seeing in GA. So I think the biggest thing, well, there's two big things for me. Number one is keeping things up to date. When there are updates made or anything that's happening, is ensuring what the impact is going to be and that you're covering it off. And then communication of that, communication of it out to any of the people who are going to be using the platform and understanding what it is, those changes are going to do. But ahead of all of this, if you're starting off from a bad place, you'll never get to a good place. You can never get back to a good place. So Mike's mentioned at the start, Jill's mentioned this as well, auditing what you have and understanding what it is you're currently doing against your objectives is a really key starting place. And if you don't start there, as I say, you'll just go down a rabbit hole of doing things for the sake of doing things, and things will be done ad hoc with no kind of consideration given. Things will cross over. They won't be aligned to other tools naturally in the way they're doing things. We get it all the time. We'll track various things when people are testing, and they'll very quickly try and align it with stuff they're doing in GA. And actually, and Jill said this twice now, it's the knowledge, it's the knowledge gap between the two things. Yes, on the face of it, we might be tracking a purchase. The reality is we might be tracking a page visit and GA is tracking something totally different. So they seem the same, they're not the same. So yeah, again, long-winded answer, but starting at a place where you're happy with what you're tracking is in a good place to begin with, ensuring that when changes come along, the impact of those changes are pushed out across all the tools they will impact, regardless of whether they are an analytics platform, a testing platform, CRM, a digital experience platform. And then communication. Communication is so critical, even if it's translating, a newsletter from GA into layman's terms, as we've said. This will impact this, and this is the outcome of it. If you're viewing this report, this is the difference. This is what the differences are going to be, whatever it might be. They're the key things for me. So I think it's just the overhead is the key piece across all of this.
Got you. For everyone that's on the webinar, we're going to have about 5 minutes of questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, could you start getting them in now? And while you're submitting those, it'd be good to just get some kind of conclusions and takeaways from this. So on that, Jill, could you share a to-do list or actionable advice for the attendees to implement regarding GA4? And then Mike regarding consent management, and James testing.
Yeah, so I will go with start with the foundations. I think there's a definite theme from our conversations today around if it's bad, it's bad, and you need to get to a good place. So check things like your knowledge internally around like the default channel groupings as an example. So that I've got a report that I built for a client, and we had header tags for each of the reports, and we actually put a little description where we put, this is using the first user default channel grouping, which means we'll only show, like we literally wrote it out as if a 5-year-old was explaining it. Because if I have to ask questions about the data that's on the report, for me, the report's failed. Like, it should be really easy, a low cognitive load, and everybody understands what's happening. Then make sure the fundamentals have happened. Sometimes when the data doesn't match, right, it's down to the fact that people, again, relied on GA4's auto migration, or they thought it was going to happen. A common one for me is the host names that are within your GA4 data stream. This is a really easy fix. Either go into your Explore report and select the host name dimension, or go into your standard reports and select a filter, and with the dimension select host name. The reason why I say this is because sometimes when people go, oh Jill, the numbers don't match, normally it's sometimes an easy fix, right, where they assumed they were just tracking one or maybe a couple of domains if they were doing cross-domain tracking. And I had one recently where they said, Jill, there's 8 domains in here. And I was like, are you sure? Because I've just counted 91. And they were like, oh, is that why the numbers are out and our conversion rate is massively diluted? I'm like, could be. And they assumed that because in UA they had a filter to say only include these domains, that would magically happen in GA4. And it doesn't. You've got to do it in Google Tag Manager now. So checking to make sure that you're collecting for the websites that you're assuming no staging, no dev sites, and that you've got the right ecosystem there. Then go through the basics for things like referral exclusions. I see that a lot. Mike probably sees it a lot as well, where they don't have a like for like, or they did a set and forget. Now, this happened with an e-commerce client recently where they added Klarna as a payment gateway, but didn't include it in the referral exclusion. So their attribution was slightly out because self-referrals can happen. And there's no documentation with GA4. So it's getting the right consistency with the fundamentals, and then with the events that you have, especially if somebody has done this migration for you, get it all on a piece of paper. I use what I call a cheat sheet for all of my clients to go from top to bottom. These are all the event names. These are the parameters that are nested under that event. Here are example parameters, and then we can see if there's anything that we can do. Because for most of the time, and I had this in UA reviews, loads of event tracking, the old category action and labels, they had no idea that was there because they never went into that report because it wasn't important to them. They focused on what mattered for their performance. So it was acquisition or page view data or something like that. So go through the default channel groupings, change your headers and be really descriptive. Check the host names, referral exclusions, the basic foundations, and then make sure that you understand what data you're collecting in terms of those events, and then either use the data if there's a happy kind of, oh, look, like my client the other day where they went, wow, we can build segments on customer types. I'm like, ta-da! Or do you need to do something and close off those blind spots? So that's what I would be doing to try and get the data to marry up a little bit closer to what you would like.
Cool, that makes sense. Jill, the other one, just a really simple one, double counting. I think we see that with many of our customers where they're double counting events through suboptimal implementation. So something to definitely have a quick look out for. We've had one question come through, and I'm conscious we got 4 minutes. So Mike, could you do a quick takeaway, conclusion takeaway, James, same, and then we'll come to your question, Abdul.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Jill said the magic word there is, look at the foundation. I realise how daunting it can be, particularly, where there's the law involved and big penalties for breaking the law, or even where a lot of people, there was this big deadline to switch to GA4. They did a rush job. They're not really sure if it was done right, and now they're in a bit of a spiral of mistrust, shall we say. So luckily, if you're not too comfortable with working with the developer tools in your browser or in Google Tag Assistant, there are lots of really nice Google Chrome extensions that will put things into nice, colorful visuals to tell you not only how and when things are firing in the page load sequence, but also where the consent indicators are coming in as well. So absolutely, my takeaway would be to take an active interest and to build your knowledge from the very bottom if you need to, particularly if things are daunting. And even though there aren't many resources admittedly being offered by Google themselves, which is quite frustrating to all involved, the community have been really good at coming up with some solutions there. So once you have those tools at your disposal, once you can build your confidence and your knowledge, then you'll be, it'll be much easier to go to your internal stakeholders and say, this is what's happening, rather than we don't know why this is happening.
Totally. And James, any thoughts before I try and address Abdul's question?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. I'll go really quickly. Combination of both the answers or summaries you've been given so far. It's an intimidating subject. It's quite easy to get lost in it very quickly. My thing would be, if you want to take something actionable from this, if you're seeing a discrepancy across platforms, don't try and tackle the whole thing. Take something, let's say a single metric which sits across those platforms which you're uncomfortable with and you're seeing a discrepancy. And as Mike just mentioned, go and understand, get the knowledge around what those things are tracking and how they're working. And once you understand that, if you apply the same logic to the rest of the metrics and you see the same discrepancies, you'll be in a very good place to start working to kind of address them. So don't be intimidated, take something simple and kind of run with that and gain the knowledge. Once you're there, I think you'll be in a much better place.
Absolutely sage advice. Abdul, I would normally send this out to the panel, but I feel like I can probably give you my own spin before asking anyone else if they've got an opinion on that. Oh God, well, Jill, you're far better versed than I am. Go for it, and I can add something if needed.
If I've read this fast enough to understand, because I have had this question as well, where people go, do we spend our time with GA learning it, or do we go elsewhere? I think we are moving towards a paid analytics ecosystem, because even though GA4 is free on the free version, there are still resources that you need to apply, whether that's a person's salary or you've got a partner and it says here that you're working with a partner, and they're only as good as the brief, right, to get that data. Now, even though there's a steep learning curve, whether you decide to stay with GA4 or go to another performance analytics tool of choice, I don't think any of them were more accurate than the other. They might have different ways of calculating things. They might have a different attribution model, because obviously there's a bit of IP here as well in terms of how these tools are working. You can, of course, move over to other providers like Mixpanel or ContentSquare or Glassbox that you've mentioned, but those tools also need the same amount of time and resources that you would have had to have given GA4 to make it work. Now, where I see a bit of a rub is that some clients, because you get to a certain size and you are using a lot of tools at your disposal, a lot of strategies and tactics, Google loves a Google product, so they're very nervous to go away from GA4 if they're spending money on paid media and they are heavily invested in a location where Google is still very prominent, that they don't want to miss out on any of the new features. They want to be using the audience builder because the other tool can't do it. They want to visualize data in a way to get more actions out of it. And I think as Google starts to evolve, they will give us more use cases. That for me is a missing point with Google's documentation. It's like, here's what this thing is, doesn't tell you what it does or how you could use it. And I think when people see some of the use cases, things start to get a bit more clarity. Obviously, there's choice, and I've worked with many clients that say we use GA4 to understand how people found us, what they did, and how we can use our paid media better. We then use our e-commerce platform for a sense of truth in terms of our e-commerce data. We then have another platform that gives us insight into it. So it could be that there's more than one. I wouldn't necessarily say you know, do you move away because you're going to get a better choice elsewhere? The grass isn't always greener. But without knowing the full nuances of your business, Abdul, and what's going on, for me, it's like you still need to put a lot of time and energy into any platform that you're going to be working on. You would still do scope survey questions, you still understand what's happening, and then decide what is the best provider that's going to give you what you need. And it could be that GA4 isn't right for you, and that's completely fine. But it depends on the type of business you've got, is my kind of brain jump on that question.
Yeah, I think, you know, I realise we're slightly over time at this point, but just to kind of conclude on that, you know, we see people using a whole host of different analytics tools and different solutions, often for different parts of the business. They all, the best results that we see are people that use the right source of truth for the right bits of the data problem. And I think, again, it's too big a question to answer and too specific a use case, but my view on this would be that you need to understand what you need to measure, why you need to measure it, and then look at the best tool for measuring that, and often then pull that into one centralized view, overlay those different sources of data, and at that point you can make an informed decision. And that may pull in data from Content Square, it may pull in data from GA4, from your testing platform, potentially your CDP or your CRM. It can be pulling in data from all sorts of places, and that's generally that, you know, the more advanced teams that we see can answer the questions, and they can then iron out some of those discrepancies in data sources by saying this is the source of truth for this data point, etc. So that's my takeaway on it. But no, just really like to take the opportunity to thank the panel for the time today. Thank everyone on the webinar for joining us and for giving up your time to hear our industry level rant on things that are good and bad about GA4 and hopefully consent mode. And hopefully you've come away having picked up at least some useful guidance, advice and practical tips on things you can do. If you do have any further questions, we'll be sending out an email over the next couple of days with this recording, also some useful resources and details of the people in the panel, and please feel free to reach out and message us if you do have any specific questions. You know, always here to try and help. The purpose of these sessions is to try and be informative and educational, so please do lean on us for that. But yeah, if no one's got any more to add, thank you all ever so much, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.